We're going to take a look in this video at multiplying and dividing fractions. Let's look at multiplication first. If we have two fractions that we're multiplying together, 3/4 times 1/2, let's say. If we're multiplying two fractions together, then very simply we multiply straight across the top and straight across the bottom. So 3/4 times 1/2 will be equal to 3 times 1 divided by 4 times 2. And this will give us 3/8. The main thing to note here when you multiply fractions is there is no need for a common denominator like when you add and subtract fractions. Notice the denominator of the first fraction is 4, the denominator of the second fraction is 2. You do not need a common denominator when you're multiplying and dividing. No common denominator when you are dividing or multiplying fractions. And that is a common error that's made all the time, so that's why I'm really stressing that point. You don't need a common denominator. When you multiply, you simply multiply straight across the top, or the numerator, and straight across the bottom in the denominator. And it should make sense to you here that we're multiplying by a fraction that's less than 1. If we're multiplying by a fraction less than 1, as opposed to a fraction like 5/2, which is a fraction that's larger than 1, but when we multiply by a fraction that's less than 1, it should make sense that our answer is smaller. And indeed, 3/8 is definitely smaller than 3/4. If we look on our ruler here, we can see that we have 3/4, so 1, 2, 3/4 is this line, and when we multiply it by a half, we'll end up getting 3/8. Multiplying by a half, we get 3/8. Remember, these divisions are the eighths, and there's 1/8, 2/8, 3/8. So really, when we multiply by a half, can you see from the ruler here, when we multiply by a half, it's really the same as dividing by 2. Here we had 3/4, and now we have 3/8. Now, to further that, let's take a look at the same time at dividing these two. Let's take 3/4 divided by 1/2. Well, the rules for dividing fractions are a little bit different than the rules for multiplying. What you need to do when you have to divide two fractions, you need 2 steps. First, you have to invert the denominator. And invert really just means to switch the numerator and the denominator. To invert means to switch. So, if we wanted to invert 1/2, right, we would then, that's not an equal sign, if we wanted to invert 1/2, we would simply move the denominator to the numerator and the numerator to the denominator, or flip the fraction. So we invert the denominator, and after we invert the denominator, then we multiply. Invert and multiply when you're dividing fractions. So we'll rewrite the 3/4, and we'll change the sign to multiplication and invert the fraction. And remember, this could also be represented, 3/4 divided by 1/2 could also be represented this way. So that's why we say invert the denominator. Just like 4 divided by 2 could be written this way, right? Whatever is after the division sign is in the denominator of the fraction. So 3/4 divided by 1/2 would then translate into 3/4 times 2 over 1. We invert the denominator of 1/2, and we change the sign to multiplication. And now we have to multiply the fractions, which is considerably easier. Multiplying straight across the top, here we get 3 times 2 over 4 times 1. 3 times 2 is 6, and 4 times 1 is 4. So we get 6 over 4. So when you multiply fractions, you multiply straight across the numerator and straight across the denominator. And when you divide, you change the sign between the two fractions to multiplication, and then you invert or flip the denominator. And remember, the denominator is always comes after the division sign. Let's take a look at another example. 7/8 times 1/4. So if we're going to multiply these two fractions, we multiply straight across the top, so we get 7 times 1, and straight across the bottom, 8 times 4. 7 times 1 is 7, and 8 times 4 is 32. Notice that when we multiply by a fraction that's less than 1, 1/4, our final answer is quite a bit smaller. It's actually 4 times smaller than our original 7/8. If we look in the same light at dividing these same two numbers, we have 7/8 divided by 1/4, and if we look at that, we want to rewrite the first fraction, so we have 7/8. We want to change the sign to multiplication, and then we want to invert the denominator. Invert the denominator and multiply. So the flip, or the invert, of 1/4 is 4 over 1. And so here now, we multiply straight across the top and straight across the bottom, and we land up with 28/8. I do want to talk for a moment right here about reducing these fractions. When you're multiplying and dividing, sometimes it's easier to reduce at this step right here rather than waiting till the final answer. This is sort of an ugly number, 28/8. That is a improper fraction, and there are some videos on improper and mixed fractions, which you can have a look at as well. But at this stage right here, when we have 7/8 times 1/4, only once the sign between them is multiplication, you can reduce. Because don't forget, this is exactly the same as 7 times 4 divided by 8 times 1. And if all the signs are multiplied, then we can easily... So at this stage here, we could look at this and reduce this 4 and this 8. If we reduce the 4 and the 8, we can reduce the 4 and the 8 because 4 goes into 4 one time, and 4 goes into 8 two times. And so now, instead of having 7 times 4 over 8 times 1, we really have an equivalent fraction of 7 times 1 over 2 times 1, which is 7 halves. And these two fractions are equivalent. 7 halves is equivalent to 28/8 because we could multiply 7/2 by 4/4, and this would give us 28/8. So you see, reducing fractions sometimes is easier to do at that stage once you've once you've flipped and changed the sign to multiplication. You can do the same thing when you're multiplying. You can reduce as well, except for with this example, when we had 7 times 1 over 8 times 4, there was nothing to reduce in those numbers. There was no number that went into 7 and 8 or 7 and 4, for example. So if we take a look at one more example, let's look at an interesting one like 7/16 times 2. 7/16 times 2, and 2 is a whole number. When you have a whole number, any whole number can be written as a fraction with a denominator of 1. So anytime you see a whole number, you can represent it as a fraction with a denominator of 1. And now you see here, we have 7/16 times 2 over 1, which would give us 14. 7 times 2, I should do that. We can have 7 times 2 over 16 times 1. And so this can either give us 14/16. 7 times 2 is 14, and 16 times 1 is 16. And now we could reduce. We could reduce at this stage here, and we know that 2 goes into 14 and 2 goes into 16. So 14 divided by 2 is 7, and 16 divided by 2 is 8. We could also, just like the last example, look at these two and reduce at this point. 2 goes into 2 once, and 2 goes into 16 8 times, and then this would translate into 7 times 1 over 8 times 1, which would give us 7/8. So if you're asked to reduce, you could do that either way. Now let's quickly take a look at dividing these two, and if we have 7/16 divided by 2, now it's really important to represent that whole number as a fraction, because it's really easy to see how you can invert or flip this fraction of 2 over 1. So following our rules for multiplication, we have 7/16. We change the sign to multiplication, and we invert or flip the denominator and make it 1/2. And now we multiply straight across the top, 7 times 1, and straight across the bottom, 16 times 2, and that gives us 7 over 32. And you see, there was no numbers here that were sort of nice to reduce, and as we see here, this is reduced in its final form, because 32 is not divisible by 7. So remember, when you're multiplying fractions, you multiply straight across the top and straight across the bottom, and reduce if you can in the end. And when you're dividing fractions, you change the sign to multiplication, and you flip the denominator, so you invert and multiply. So that should give you a good review of multiplying and